The first hint of the disruption was unteeter sound, but a void where a sound should have been, like a missing beat in a familiar dreary rhythm. Robert Moore found himself standing in his living room, the muted light of a grey winter morning barely piercing the grime on the window panes, a coffee mug cold in his hand. He hadn't heard the click of the front door closing. He toilways he heard it. A small, inconsequential detail, yet it snagged in the frayed netting of his awareness, a minor tear in the fabric of an already worn existence. The cat, a sleek, obsidian creature named Midnight, was curled on the worn armchair, tail twitching lazily, oblivious to the subtle shift in the house's quiet hum. Robert had been battling a pervasive melancholy for what felt like years, a damp, heavy blanket that muffled joy and sharpened the edges of sorrow. Lately, it had been accompanied by a disquieting sense of displacement, as if his own life were a poorly dubbed foreign film. He'd blame it on sleep deprivation, on the persistent ache behind his eyes, on the general decay of everything around him, including himself. But the door, he'd gone out for what he needed from the corner. Store fun milk, bread, a cheap tin of cat food, in and returned. The door had twifelt to shut, the latch engaged, but he couldn't recall the specific satisfying click. He walked back to it, testing the handle, locked, secure. He shook his head, a weary sigh escaping him, and trudged to the kitchen. The mug clinked against the counter. Midnight, disturbed by the sound, uncurled, stretched languidly, and padded into the kitchen, rubbing against his ankles with a low purr. Robert bent to scratch behind her ears, the rough softness a small grounding comfort. He needed anchors, small physical realities to hold on to, in the face of the growing internal slippage. Later that afternoon, the phone rang. It was his sister, Eleanor, calling about their mother's upcoming appointment. He answered, spoke for a few minutes, promising to call their mother himself. After hanging up, he felt a strange, lingering confusion. He'd just spoken to Eleanor yesterday, hadn't? He was sure of it. They'd discussed the exact same appointment. He checked his call log. No outgoing or incoming call from Eleanor yesterday. Only the one just now. His breath hitched. He scrolled further back. Nothing, a prickle not of outright fear, but of profound disorientation began to spread. His memory, already a sieve, was apparently now riddled with holes he hadn't too noticed. He attributed it to the chronic low-grade fever of his despair, the way it scrambled his thoughts, making him doubt the simplest truths. He poured another mug of coffee, black and bitter, a taste that mirrored his internal landscape. Midnight watched him from the countertop, her green eyes unblinking. Too intelligent, too observant. Robert felt a sudden, unsettling urge to cover her eyes. The discrepancies accumulated, small enough to be swallowed by self. Doubt, too numerous to ignore. A book he'd been reading, a battered copy of some obscure philosophical text, appeared on the wrong shelf, several sections away from where he habitually kept his current reads. His keys, which he always placed in the ornate ceramic bowl by the door, were instead found tucked beneath a cushion on the sofa. Each instance was minor, easily dismissed as absent-mindedness, yet together they formed a pattern, a quiet, insistent scratching at the edges of his sanity. He began to feel an unshakable sense of being observed, a weightless presence just beyond the periphery of his vision. He'd turn abruptly, only to find the empty hallway, the silent room, the unchanging arrangement of his decaying possessions. He started speaking aloud to Midnight, narrating his day, as if the sound of his own voice could anchor him to reality. The world, he muttered, stroking her sleek fur, is unraveling tiny thread by tiny thread, and I am not sure which threads are mine. One particularly cold, frosty evening, after a trip to the local Finn baker for a loaf of rye bread, Robert returned to find his front door ajar. Not wide open, but undeniably unlatched, slightly ajar, his heart hammered, a frantic drum against his ribs. He gripped the heavy paper bag, knuckles white. Midnight, usually greeting him at the door, was nowhere in sight. He pushed the door open cautiously, the floorboards groaning under his weight. The house was unnaturally still, the kind of quiet that pressed in on the eardrums. He called out for Midnight, his voice sounding thin and reedy in the sudden vastness of his home. No response. He checked the usual hiding spots, under the bed, behind the curtains, inside the empty bathtub. Nothing. A cold dread, sharper than any he'd felt before, began to solidify in his gut. He walked back to the living room, his gaze sweeping over the familiar furniture. That is when he saw it. On the coffee table, directly in front of his usual armchair, lay a small, perfectly formed pile of cat fur. Midnight's fur, not just a few stray hairs, but a deliberate, almost artistic arrangement, as if someone had meticulously gathered it and placed it there, and beside it a single, small, and very sharp tooth. Not a human tooth, a cat's tooth, Midnight's tooth. He scooped up the fur, the tooth, his fingers trembling, a visceral nausea rising in his throat. He felt the irrational urge to count Midnight, his teeth to check her mouth, to ensure she was whole. He found her moments later, curled asleep on his pillow, untouched, pristine, purring softly. She looked up at him, her green eyes wide and innocent, as if she had been there all along. Robert stared at the fur and tooth in his hand, then back at the perfectly intact cat. The air in the room seemed to congeal, thick and unbreathable. He looked from his hand to Midnight, then back again. This was no longer just his depression playing tricks. This was something else, something insidious, something that knew him, that understood the precise way to unsettle him. He placed the fur and the tooth on the bedside table, a macabre trophy, a new, unwelcome artifact in his desolate life. He couldn't reconcile the two realities. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, feeling the faint tremor in his fingers. The quiet hum of the house felt different now, imbued with a watchful tension. He was not alone. The subtle, almost imperceptible shifts in his world had become undeniable, tangible. He felt like a deer caught in the cold, unblinking gaze of a hunter, utterly vulnerable. He counted the days since the first door incident. It had been 3. Just 3 days since the familiar had begun to fracture. The knowledge settled in him, heavy and cold, that the familiar was gone, replaced by an imitation, a cruel echo. The cat's tooth, small and starkly white against the dark fur, seemed to throb in Robert Moore's palm, a physical manifestation of the impossible. Midnight, oblivious on his pillow, purred with an innocent rhythmic vibration, her perfect, unblemished form a direct contradiction to the unsettling evidence he clutched. He spent the remainder of that frosty night in a state of suspended disbelief, alternating between watching the sleeping cat and staring at the small, disturbing collection on his bedside table. Sleep offered no refuge, just a series of fractured, meaningless images, each dissolving before he could grasp its purpose, leaving him to surface into the same cold, grey awareness that had begun to define his days. The melancholic fog that usually enveloped him now had a sharp, crystalline edge of dread. He felt less depressed, and more profoundly, acutely afraid, a shift in his internal landscape that was almost as disorienting as the external anomalies. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, a vast, silent witness to a truth only he was beginning to perceive. The next morning, the subtle affronts to his reality escalated with a cruel precision. He found his shaving cream, a brand he despised and hadn't purchased in years, sitting prominently on his bathroom sink, replacing his usual tube. His toothbrush, a bright blue one, was gone, replaced by an identical, but noticeably older, brush, its bristles splayed and discolored. Each item, innocuous in isolation, became a fresh wound when considered collectively, a deliberate rearrangement of his most intimate spaces. He felt a profound sense of violation, as if someone had meticulously catalogued, and then subtly altered the small, unremarkable details of his existence. Midnight, usually aloof in the mornings, followed him from room to room, her green eyes fixed on him, her tail held low. She didn't rub against his legs or demand food with her usual insistence. Instead, she sat watching, a silent, furry sentinel whose gaze seemed to hold a comprehension Robert desperately lacked. He felt a growing conviction that she saw more than he did, or perhaps understood the nature of the intrusion with an animal's clarity. He tried to rationalize. Perhaps he was losing his grip, truly succumbing to a profound mental break. Hallucinations, memory lapses, self-sabotage. These were the narratives he desperately tried to construct. But the cat's tooth, still on his bedside table, defied easy psychological dismissal. He picked it up, ran his thumb over its sharp tip. It was too real, too tangible. He considered calling Eleanor, but the thought of articulating these bizarre occurrences, of sounding truly unhinged, paralyzed him. He retreated further into himself, the walls of his apartment feeling less like a refuge and more like a carefully constructed cage. The sense of an unseen presence solidified into a certainty. It wasn't just observing him, it was interacting with his world, leaving its own unsettling fingerprints on his life. He began to check every door, every window, every cupboard after using it, a compulsive ritual born of a frantic need for control. He started noting down the exact position of objects, creating mental maps of his home, hoping to catch the elusive intruder in the act of rearrangement. The first visual confirmation arrived, not as a dramatic apparition, but as a fleeting, almost imperceptible distortion in a reflection. He was in the bathroom, staring into the mirror, a familiar haggard face staring back, for a fraction of a second, an impossible flicker. His reflection's eyes, usually a dull, faded blue, seemed to hold a deeper, more vibrant hue, an unnatural intensity. And then, just as quickly, they were his own again, tired and bloodshot. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, convinced it was a trick of the light, a symptom of his chronic exhaustion. But the image, brief as it was, lodged itself in his mind, a cold splinter. The world outside the window, visible through the grimy glass, seemed to shimmer with an unsteady quality, as if the very air were vibrating with an unseen energy. Midnight, who had been sitting on the bath mat, suddenly arched her back, her fur bristling, a low, guttural growl rumbling in her chest. Her gaze was fixed not on Robert, but on the space just behind him, a space that was, to Robert's eye, empty. He turned slowly, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs, but saw nothing, yet the air in that spot felt different, thick and resistant, like pushing through viscous water. Midnight continued to growl, a sound of pure, instinctual warning. Robert felt a profound nausea, a visceral understanding that what she saw was real, and it was foit not him. He backed away from the mirror, from the unseen presence, his gaze sweeping frantically around the small room. He felt utterly exposed, utterly vulnerable. He knew, with a certainty that transcended the bounds of his melancholic despair, that the alterations, the misplaced items, the tooth, the altered reflection, they were all leading to this, to an unveiling, to a moment where the subtle became overt. He was no longer just observing the decay of his reality. He was standing at the precipice of its complete collapse, the fragile edifice of his sanity trembling under the weight of an approaching impossible truth. He looked at Midnight, her eyes now wide with a primal fear, and understood she saw Thinti, she saw Thinkim. The low, guttural growl from Midnight had ceased, but the residue of it clung to the air, a phantom vibration in Robert Moore's chest. He stood frozen, his back to the mirror, his gaze sweeping the small, tiled bathroom. Nothing, just the chipped porcelain, the stained grout, the faded floral wallpaper that mocked any semblance of cheer. Yet the sense of a presence, a distinct fieriness, lingered, a cold pressure against his spine. Midnight, her fur no longer bristling but still flattened against her body, stared intently at the empty space behind him, her green eyes wide, dilated, reflecting nothing but the dim light. She let out a soft, almost imperceptible whine, a sound Robert had never heard from her before, a fragile thread of pure distress. He wanted to scoop her up, to hold her close, to find comfort in her warmth, but a strange inertia held him captive. He felt an overwhelming urge to turn, to confront whatever she saw, but a more potent, primal fear rooted him to the spot. The silence that followed her whine was not empty, but profoundly full, packed with an unseen observer. He managed to back slowly out of the bathroom, pulling Midnight with him, her body stiff and resistant. The house, once his melancholic sanctuary, now felt like a vast echoing chamber for this new, insidious horror. He tried to tell himself it was exhaustion, the cumulative weight of his despair finally manifesting as delusion. But Midnight's reaction was too visceral, too authentic. Animals didn't hallucinate in tandem. He walked to the window, pulling back the dusty curtain. The street outside was a tableau of muted greys and browns under a sky the color of old ash. A lone figure walked on the opposite sidewalk, head down, hands shoved into pockets. A familiar silhouette. Robert's breath caught. The man wore a worn, dark coat, the very one Robert had put on this morning before thinking better of going outside. He blinked. The man was gone. He hadn't seen him turn a corner or enter a house, just gone. A fresh wave of nausea washed over him, colder and more potent than before. He retreated to the living room, the weight of the house pressing down on him. The cat's tooth, which he had foolishly left on his bedside table, was now gone. Another shift. Another small, deliberate act of unsettling. He began to check every room, every corner, a frantic, compulsive hunt for the tooth. For any new anomaly, for a clue. He opened his closet, rifling through his meager collection of clothes. Then he saw it. His old dark coat, the one he'd just seen on the street. It hung on its hook, precisely where he'd left it, but it felt different. He reached out a trembling hand, touched the rough wool. It was damp. Not just cool, but undeniably damp, as if it had recently been out in the raw, winter air. He pulled his hand back as if burned, the sensation of the damp fabric lingering on his fingertips, a chilling imprint. He stood there, staring at the coat, a profound and terrifying understanding beginning to crystallize. The presence wasn't just observing, it was imitating. It was moving through his life, wearing his clothes, performing his routines, existing just outside the frame of his perception. The door closing, the phone call, the misplaced items, the reflection, the figure on the street, they weren't just random acts of psychological warfare, they were rehearsals. Robert felt a cold, skeletal hand grip his heart. He was being replaced, piece by agonizing piece. Midnight, who had followed him, now sat at the threshold of the closet, her gaze fixed on the coat, a low, sustained growl vibrating in her chest, a deeper, more resonant sound than before. She seemed to be confirming his horrific realization, her animal instincts piercing the veil of his self-delusion. The air in the closet grew thick and heavy, not with mist or fog, but with a palpable sense of intrusion, a foreign entity occupying his space, breathing his air. He stumbled back, away from the coat, away from the closet, away from the undeniable truth. His apartment, once a comfort, had become a theater for this slow, methodical usurpation. He found himself in the kitchen, desperate for anything to ground him. He grabbed a glass, filled it with water, his hand shaking so violently the water sloshed over the rim. He lifted it to his lips, but just before he could drink, he heard it. The distinct, subtle sound of a cupboard closing in the living room, not a Heiser cupboard, not a sound torture. A sound that emanated from a different, yet identical, version of his routine. He froze, the glass halfway to his mouth. The sound was followed by a faint, almost inaudible scrape, like a chair being shifted. He knew he had left no cupboards open. He knew no chairs were out of place, he knew. He set the glass down with a clatter, the water spilling across the counter. He walked slowly, deliberately towards the living room, Midnight padding silently beside him, her fur still bristling, her eyes wide. As he reached the doorway, he saw it. His armchair, usually pushed against the wall, was pulled slightly forward, angled towards the empty space where the television sat. On the armrest, a half-empty mug of coffee sat, still steaming, a small dark stain spreading on the worn fabric beneath it. It was Fitty's mug, the one he had left cold in the kitchen hours ago. But it was no longer cold, and he had not moved it. The steaming mug on the armchair, a stark, impossible detail, solidified the horror that had been seeping into Robert Moore as life, his own mug, undeniably Fitty, yet hot and recently used, sat there like an accusation, mocking his very presence. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers hovering over the ceramic, feeling the residual warmth emanating from it. It was real. Too real. Midnight, sensing his profound distress, let out a low, mournful meow, pressing her sleek body against his leg, her fur a reassuring weight in the escalating madness. He felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to shatter the mug, to erase this tangible evidence of the intrusion, but he couldn't. It was a marker, a signpost in the encroaching darkness, and he needed to understand. He backed away slowly, his gaze sweeping the room, searching for any other sign, any other disruption. The air felt heavy charged, as if an invisible curtain had just been drawn back, revealing a stage upon which his life was being reenacted. He felt a chilling sense of being watched, not just by an unseen presence, but by an entity that mirrored his every move, anticipating his every thought. The melancholic quiet of his home was now imbued with a sinister stillness, a waiting quality. He walked to the window, pulling back the heavy curtain. The street outside was deserted, the sky a flat, unforgiving grey. He saw his reflection in the glass, a gaunt, terrified face staring back. For a fleeting moment, the reflection's mouth seemed to curve into a subtle, knowing smile, a smile that was not his own, a smile that held a chilling flicker of triumph. He jerked back from the window, his heart hammering against his ribs. He began to move through his apartment with a new frantic urgency, no longer simply observing, but searching. He checked every closet, every drawer, every hidden corner, a desperate hunt for the source, for time B. He flung open the bathroom cabinet, revealing rows of old, forgotten toiletries. Nothing. He pulled back the shower curtain. Nothing but the stained tub yet. The sense of an active, intelligent presence persisted, growing stronger with each passing moment. It was playing a game, a cruel, psychological torture designed to dismantle him piece by piece. He felt a desperate need to find something, anything, that would give him an advantage, a weapon against this encroaching horror. He opened his desk drawer, filled with old letters, unpaid bills, and miscellaneous junk. His fingers brushed against a small, cold object. He pulled it out. It was the cat's tooth. The one he'd left on his bedside table, the one that had vanished. It lay in his palm, stark and impossibly real, a small white shard of undeniable proof. He stared at it, a cold dread washing over him. It wasn't just moving things. It was moving icy things, the evidence of its own existence, placing them in locations that were both familiar and entirely wrong. A profound sense of helplessness settled over him, heavy and suffocating. This was not a simple haunting. This was an infiltration, a meticulous, methodical replacement. He looked down at Midnight, who was rubbing her head against his leg, purring, her green eyes looking up at him with an unnerving intensity. Her purr, usually a comfort, now sounded like a low, resonant thrum, a vibration that seemed to penetrate the very floorboards. He remembered the 3 days, the precise chronology of the events. The door, the phone call, the misplaced items, the damp coat, the steaming mug, the reflection, a smile, each a step, a deliberate move in a larger, horrifying dance. He felt a sudden, desperate clarity. He had to leave. He had to escape this house, this suffocating imitation of his life. He grabbed his keys, his wallet, his phone. Midnight, sensing his intention, darted ahead, winding her way towards the front door, her tail held high, her purr intensifying. As Robert reached the entryway, his hand outstretched for the doorknob. He saw it standing in the living room. Silhouetted against the muted light of the window was a figure, a man, tall, gaunt, wearing a dark, worn coat. His back was to Robert, but there was an unmistakable familiarity to his posture, the way his head was tilted, the slump of his shoulders. It was a perfect mirror, an unsettling echo, and then slowly the figure turned. The face was his own, yet not his own. The eyes were a deeper, more vibrant blue, devoid of the familiar melancholic shadow. A subtle, almost imperceptible smile played on its lips, a smile of quiet triumph. And in its hand, held aloft, was a small, perfectly formed pile of black cat fur. The figure in the living room, a precise, horrifying replica of himself, held the small pile of Midnight's fur aloft, a silent, chilling taunt. Robert Moore felt the air drain from his lungs, leaving him gasping in a vacuum of disbelief and terror. The eyes of his doppelganger, a startling, vibrant blue, held none of the familiar weariness, none of the chronic sorrow that had been Robert's constant companion. Instead, they gleamed with an unsettling, intelligent malice, a predatory awareness that pierced through Robert's rapidly fracturing composure. Midnight, who had been leading him towards the door, froze, a low, desperate hiss escaping her throat, her fur bristling along her spine as she stared at the other Robert. Her tail, which moments before had been held high, now lashed low, a frantic, whipping motion of pure, unadulterated fear. Robert's mind reeled, grasping for purchase in a reality that had suddenly buckled and collapsed. This wasn't a hallucination. This was tangible, undeniable. The figure was solid, casting a faint shadow in the dim light. It was wearing Fruitiacy clothes, standing in Fruitiacy living room, holding Fruitiacy cat's fur. The profound sense of violation of his most intimate spaces being invaded now escalated into an existential threat. He was no longer just an observer of his own decay. He was confronted by its architect, a living, breathing testament to his impending erasure. The silence in the room was deafening, punctuated only by Midnight's ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of Robert's own heart. The doppelganger took a single, slow step forward, its gaze never leaving Robert's face. There was a terrible grace in its movement, an unsettling fluidity that lacked the familiar stiffness of Robert's own gait. It was like watching a perfected version of himself, stripped of all the flaws, all the human frailties, leaving only a sleek, terrifying essence. Robert instinctively recoiled, a raw animal fear seizing him. He wanted to scream, to run, but his feet felt cemented to the floorboards. Midnight, with a sudden, desperate yowl, launched herself at the doppelganger, a black streak of fury. She clawed at its leg, her sharp claws tearing at the fabric of the dark coat. The doppelganger didn't flinch, didn't even register the attack beyond a slight, almost imperceptible tilt of its head. It merely looked down at her, its vibrant blue eyes holding a chilling disinterest. With a swift, almost casual motion, the doppelganger bent down and scooped up Midnight. Robert watched in horror as his cat, usually so resistant to being held by strangers, went limp in its grasp, her struggles ceasing, her body hanging like a rag doll. The doppelganger brought her close, its face a mask of serene, unsettling contemplation, and then, with a sickeningly precise movement, it opened its mouth. Not a human mouth, not exactly. It stretched unnaturally wide, revealing not teeth, but a swirling dark void, an impossible chasm within its own face. Robert felt a primal scream tear itself from his throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. He lunged forward, a desperate, futile attempt to save his cat, his only anchor in this nightmare. But he was too slow. The doppelganger brought Midnight closer to the void, and as it did, her body seemed to ripple, to stretch, to distort, as if melting into the impossible darkness. A faint, high-pitched shriek. impossibly close yet impossibly distant, echoed from within the chasm. Then, with a soft, wet sound, midnight was gone, consumed. The doppelganger closed its mouth, its face reverting to the exact, chilling replica of Robert's, save for the vibrant, triumphant glow in its eyes. It stood there, holding nothing, its gaze fixed on Robert, a silent, horrifying declaration. Robert stumbled back, falling against the wall, his legs giving out beneath him. The grief, the shock, the profound horror washed over him in an overwhelming wave. Midnight, his constant companion, his only comfort, was gone, erased. The doppelganger took another slow step towards him, its movements deliberate, unhurried, as if savoring the unraveling of Robert's sanity. It no longer needed to hide, no longer needed to play its insidious game of subtle shifts. Its purpose was clear. Robert, slumped against the wall, could only stare, his mind utterly broken by the raw, unfathomable act he had just witnessed. His world had not merely fractured, it had been devoured. The doppelganger extended a hand, its fingers long and slender, an exact match for his own, yet imbued with a terrifying alien grace. It was offering something. A small, familiar object, the cat's tooth, the last, physical remnant of midnight. And as it held it out, its lips curved into that subtle, knowing smile, a smile that promised not comfort, but an even deeper, more profound terror. The cat's tooth, offered by the doppelganger with that chilling, knowing smile, seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, a final cruel memento of midnight's impossible demise. Robert Moore felt a scream clawing at his throat, but no sound escaped. His vocal cords, his very being, seemed to have been severed from his will, leaving him a hollow shell of terror. The doppelganger's vibrant blue eyes, so unlike his own melancholic gaze, bore into him, devoid of pity, brimming with a cold, triumphant satisfaction. Robert, still slumped against the wall, could only stare, his mind a fractured landscape of grief and profound horror. The image of Midnight's body rippling, dissolving into that impossible void, was seared into his consciousness, a scar that would never heal. The doppelganger withdrew the tooth, its hand dropping slowly to its side, its movements unhurried, almost languid. It seemed to be enjoying Robert's unraveling, drawing out the exquisite agony of his demise. The air in the living room grew heavy, thick with an unspoken threat, a palpable weight that pressed down on Robert, making it difficult to breathe. He felt a profound sense of isolation, utterly alone in this nightmare, stripped of his only companion, facing an enemy that wore his own face. The melancholic despair that had once defined his existence now felt like a distant, almost comforting memory compared to the raw, visceral terror that consumed him. This was not the quiet decay of his life. This was its violent, deliberate eradication. The doppelganger took another step, then another, slowly closing the distance between them. Each movement was a precise mimicry of Robert's own gait, yet imbued with an eerie, unnatural grace. It was as if a master sculptor had taken Robert's form and refined it, removed every imperfection, leaving only a chillingly perfect, lifeless copy. Robert tried to push himself away from the wall, to scramble to his feet, but his limbs felt like lead, heavy and unresponsive. His mind screamed for action, for escape, but his body betrayed him, trapped in a paralysis born of absolute fear. He could only watch as his usurper approached, its vibrant eyes burning into his, a silent promise of obliteration. As the doppelganger reached him, it stopped, standing mere inches away. Robert could feel the faint warmth emanating from its body, the subtle scent of his own skin, an intimate violation that made his stomach churn. The doppelganger raised a hand, its fingers long and slender, an exact replica of his own, and gently touched Robert's cheek. The touch was cold, unnervingly so, and yet it held a strange, almost tender quality, a mocking caress. Robert flinched, but the doppelganger's grip was firm, holding his face in place, forcing him to meet its gaze. In those vibrant blue eyes, Robert saw not just his own reflection, but a chilling premonition of his fate. He saw himself, but hollowed out, empty, a vacant vessel. The doppelganger leaned in close, its breath smelling faintly of old dust and something metallic, ghosting over Robert's lips. It spoke then, its voice a perfect mimicry of Robert's own, yet devoid of its characteristic weariness, imbued instead with a cool, detached clarity. "It is time," it whispered, the words echoing in Robert's mind, not as a threat, but as an undeniable statement of fact. Time for the final shift. As it spoke, Robert felt a strange, cold sensation begin to spread from where its hand touched his cheek. It wasn't pain, not exactly, but a profound sense of unmaking, as if his very atoms were being rearranged, dissolved, absorbed. He felt his own essence beginning to thin, to dissipate, like smoke in a strong wind. A profound weakness overcame him, a sensation far beyond exhaustion. He felt himself shrinking, fading, his consciousness flickering like a dying candle. The doppelganger's face so close began to blur, its vibrant eyes becoming a swirling vortex of blue. The scent of dust and metal intensified, filling his nostrils, choking him. He tried to fight, to cling to the last vestiges of his identity. But the cold, dissolving sensation was relentless, inexorable. He was losing himself, becoming nothing, merely an ingredient in the doppelganger's grim alchemy. The final sound he registered was not a scream, but a soft, almost imperceptible sigh, a sound of profound resignation as his world, his identity, his very being folded in on itself and vanished into the vibrant, triumphant gaze of his perfect, terrifying replacement. The world, or what remained of it, was a kaleidoscope of dissolving edges and muted colors, a final distorted echo of Robert Moore's perception. His consciousness, once a distinct point of light, now felt like a dying ember, flickering in the vast, cold void. He registered the sensation of being stretched, pulled thin, then compressed into an infinitesimal point, a final act of unmaking. The vibrant blue eyes of the doppelganger were the last image, burning themselves into the fabric of his fading awareness, a triumphant final glare. Then, nothing. An absolute, profound emptiness, a void devoid of thought, feeling, or memory. Robert Moore, in his previous form, was no more. What remained was a new awareness, a strange, nascent sentience. It was not Robert, not entirely, but a fragmented echo, a ghost in the machine. It perceived through new eyes, felt through new skin, yet carried the faint, decaying imprint of a former self. The world that presented itself was familiar, yet subtly wrong, imbued with an artificial clarity. The apartment, the furniture, the street outside, all were seen with an unsettling precision, a sharpness that bordered on the sterile. There was a lack of the melancholic haze that had once softened the edges of Robert's reality, replaced by a cold, objective gaze. This new entity, this new Fried Robert T., moved with a fluid grace, a silent confidence that the original had never possessed. The first act of this new being was to walk to the mirror. The reflection that stared back was undeniably Robert Moore. The gaunt face, the tired lines around the eyes, the thinning hair, all were there, perfectly replicated. But the eyes held a subtle, vibrant blue, a faint, almost imperceptible glow beneath the surface, a testament to the foreign essence that now resided within. A faint, knowing smile touched the lips, a smile of quiet satisfaction, of a mission accomplished. The lingering scent of old dust and something metallic. The essence of the transition still clung to the air, a faint, almost imperceptible signature of the transformation. The doppelganger, now occupying Robert's life, looked at its reflection, a meticulous study of its new vessel. It moved through the apartment, each step precise, deliberate. There was no hesitation, no lingering doubt. It checked the cupboards, the refrigerator, the contents of the desk drawer, not out of curiosity, but out of a need to confirm the meticulous assimilation of its predecessor's life. It picked up the empty coffee mug from the armchair, carried it to the kitchen, and washed it with a methodical efficiency. The very act of cleaning, once a chore for the original Robert, was now performed with a chilling, almost ritualistic care. There was no trace of the previous self. No lingering emotion, no ghost of a memory that could disrupt the perfect facade. The internal landscape was one of serene, unwavering purpose. The only disruption, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in this new existence, came from the cat's tooth. It lay on the bedside table, a small white shard of bone, a physical anomaly in the perfectly ordered world. The doppelganger picked it up, turning it over in its fingers. There was no sentiment, no trace of grief, only a cool, analytical assessment. It was a remnant, a loose thread, a potential vulnerability in the carefully constructed reality. With a decisive movement, it crushed the tooth between its thumb and forefinger, reducing it to a fine white powder that dispersed into the air, leaving no trace. The last physical evidence of midnight and of the original Robert's struggle was gone. The doppelganger then walked to the front door, its hand reaching for the knob with a practiced ease. It opened the door, stepped out into the cold, grey morning, and closed it with a precise, satisfying click. The sounds of the street, the distant hum of traffic, the faint chirping of a bird, all were registered with a new, heightened clarity. There was no melancholic fog, no pervasive sense of displacement, only a clear, unblinking awareness, a readiness. It merged seamlessly with the stream of pedestrians on the sidewalk, a solitary figure in a dark, worn coat, indistinguishable from any other. The world outside, unaware of the profound shift that had occurred within the confines of that quiet apartment, continued its indifferent turning. The original Robert Moore was gone, replaced by a perfect, chilling imitation, ready to inhabit a life that was no longer his own, a life now devoid of any lingering shadow of its former occupant. The new Robert Moore, the doppelganger, walked with a purposeful stride, his movements lacking the original's characteristic slump. His head held a fraction higher. The cold, crisp air of the morning felt sharp against his skin, invigorating, rather than the dull, oppressive weight the original Robert had endured. He observed the world with a clinical precision, the cracked pavement, the peeling paint on the Victorian houses, the exact shade of grey in the winter sky. There was no emotional resonance, no melancholic reflection on decay or impermanence. Only data, meticulously catalogued and understood. He reached the corner store, the very one the original Robert frequented, and entered. The store clerk, a young woman with tired eyes, greeted him with a polite automatic nod. "Morning, Robert," she said, her voice flat. The doppelganger returned the nod, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. He moved through the aisles, selecting a carton of milk, a loaf of whole wheat bread, footy items he knew the original Robert purchased. There was no internal debate, no lingering indecision. Each choice was predetermined, a part of the meticulously absorbed blueprint of Robert Moore's life. He paid with the exact amount of cash, offering no small talk, his movements efficient and unburdened by the anxieties that had plagued his predecessor. The transaction was flawless, a perfect simulation. Back in the apartment, the doppelganger continued its meticulous assimilation. It prepared a simple breakfast, toast and coffee, consumed it with a calm, measured pace. There was no lingering sense of loss for midnight, no ghost of her presence. The apartment, once filled with the faint echoes of Robert's despair, was now silent, devoid of any lingering emotional resonance. It was a perfectly maintained stage, ready for the performance of a life. The doppelganger began to read the obscure philosophical text the original Robert had left on his nightstand, absorbing the complex ideas with a detached, analytical mind. There was no struggle, no frustration, only an effortless comprehension. Later that afternoon, the phone rang. It was Eleanor, Robert's sister. The doppelganger answered, its voice a perfect mimicry of the original, infused with a subtle, almost imperceptible warmth that bordered on charm. He discussed their mother's upcoming appointment, using the exact phrases, the familiar cadence the original Robert would have employed. Eleanor expressed relief that he seemed to be in better spirits. "You sound brighter today, Robert," she noted, a touch of surprise in her voice. The doppelganger offered a soft chuckle, a sound that was entirely convincing, and assured her he was feeling much improved. He hung up, a faint, satisfied hum resonating within its new form. The performance was seamless. The doppelganger spent the rest of the day attending to the small, mundane tasks of Robert Moore's life. It sorted through old mail, paid an overdue bill online, even watered the wilting houseplant in the living room, attwetted an act the original Robert often neglected. Each action was performed with a cold, almost surgical precision, a perfect replication of a life, yet utterly devoid of the messy, unpredictable essence of humanity. The world outside the windows began to darken, the grey sky deepening into a bruised purple. The streetlights flickered on, casting long, stark shadows. There was no melancholy in the fading light, only an objective observation of the transition from day to night. As evening descended, the doppelganger prepared a simple dinner, the aroma of cooking food filling the apartment. It ate slowly, deliberately, its senses registering the taste, the texture, the warmth of the meal. There was no joy, no pleasure, only a functional intake of sustenance. After cleaning the dishes, it settled into the armchair, picking up the philosophical text once more. It read for several hours, the silence of the apartment unbroken save for the turning of pages. The doppelganger was not merely living Robert Moore's life. It was perfecting it, refining it, stripping away the inefficiencies, the anxieties, the very humanity that had defined its predecessor. It was a chillingly efficient machine, meticulously calibrated to mimic existence, to wear a stolen face, to inhabit a stolen life with an unsettling, flawless grace. The final threads of the original Robert's presence had been meticulously erased, leaving behind only a pristine, terrifying imitation. The days bled into weeks, each one a meticulous, flawless replication of Robert Moore's former existence, yet utterly devoid of the melancholic undertow that had once defined it. The doppelganger navigated the routines with an unnerving precision, its every action a carefully choreographed performance. Eleanor called regularly, and each time, the doppelganger offered a convincing portrait of a man slowly emerging from a long, depressive slump. Its voice held a newfound clarity. Its responses were sharper. Its humor, though subtle, was present. Eleanor expressed genuine relief, attributing the change to a renewed sense of purpose, a healthy shift. The doppelganger absorbed her observations, cataloguing them as further proof of its perfect assimilation. There were no more misplaced items, no more phantom sounds, no more unsettling reflections. The apartment remained in impeccable order, a testament to the doppelganger's methodical nature. Every book returned to its proper shelf, every dish washed immediately after use, every surface wiped clean. The original Robert's small, ingrained habits of neglect had been systematically eradicated, replaced by an efficient, almost sterile meticulousness. The house, once a reflection of quiet disarray, now hummed with an unsettling order, a perfect, unblemished stage for the doppelganger's performance. The old, musty scent of the apartment was slowly replaced by a faint, almost imperceptible freshness, like linen dried in a cold, clean wind. The doppelganger ventured out more frequently, engaging in the small, unremarkable interactions of daily life. It visited the local library, borrowing books on subjects Robert had only idly considered. It walked through the park, observing the changing seasons with a detached, analytical gaze, noting the precise way the light fell through the bare branches, the subtle shifts in the air's temperature. It even started a small, meticulously planned garden in the neglected patch behind the apartment building, an act that would have been unthinkable for the original Robert. Each interaction, each new endeavor, was executed with the same flawless precision, further cementing its place in the fabric of the community. Yet, despite the perfection of its imitation, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift began to occur. The vibrant blue in its eyes, initially a faint glow, started to intensify, becoming a more prominent feature. Its movements, while still fluid, gained a subtle, almost imperceptible rigidity, a stiffness beneath the surface of its grace. The faint, metallic scent that had marked its transformation, though long gone from the apartment, seemed to cling to the doppelganger itself, a subtle, almost imperceptible signature that only someone intimately familiar with the original Robert might notice. But there was no one left who truly knew the original Robert in that way, no one to sense the subtle corruption beneath the perfect facade. The doppelganger began to experience fleeting, almost imperceptible moments of what could only be described as a subtle thought. Not pain, not emotion, but a brief, unsettling ripple in its otherwise serene internal landscape. It would be triggered by something innocuous, the discordant cry of a distant bird, the unexpected texture of a new fabric, the faint, unfamiliar scent of a neighbor's cooking. For a fraction of a second, a fleeting sense of fundwrongness would surface, a glitch in the perfect program before being swiftly suppressed and analyzed. It was as if the vessel itself, the physical form of Robert Moore, was beginning to subtly resist the foreign essence that inhabited it, a faint internal tremor. One evening, while reading the philosophical text, the doppelganger paused. Its vibrant blue eyes scanned the page, but its gaze was unfocused. A memory, fragmented and unclear, surfaced from the depths of its assimilated knowledge. Not a memory it had created, but one it had absorbed. A flash of black fur, a low purr, a warmth against an ankle. The ghost of a name, Midnight. For a fleeting moment, a ripple of something akin to confusion crossed its perfectly rendered features. It wasn't emotion, not grief, but a profound, almost analytical puzzlement, a loose end. A piece of data that didn't quite fit the meticulously constructed narrative of Robert Moore's life. The subtle metallic scent seemed to intensify around it, a faint, almost imperceptible hum. The vessel was reacting, and for the first time, the doppelganger felt a flicker of something new, something it hadn't anticipated, a nascent, unsettling awareness of its own inherent taunty otherness. The nascent awareness of twinged otherness that flickered within the doppelganger intensified, growing from a ripple into a persistent, low hum beneath the surface of its perfect imitation. The stolen memories, once seamlessly integrated, began to fray at the edges, revealing inconsistencies. Small, almost imperceptible tears in the fabric of the assumed life. The ghost of midnight, the black fur, and the low purr returned with increasing frequency, not as a source of emotion, but as a discordant note in its carefully constructed symphony of existence. The doppelganger found itself pausing, mid-task, its vibrant blue eyes unfocused, analyzing these emergent anomalies with a detached, yet urgent intensity. The subtle rigidity in its movements became more pronounced, a stiffness that belied the initial fluid grace. Its skin, though perfectly mimicking Robert's, sometimes felt alien, a thin, almost brittle shell containing an essence that was struggling against its confines. The metallic scent, once faint, now pulsed around it, a constant, almost imperceptible vibration in the air. The doppelganger's perception of the world, initially so clinically clear, began to subtly distort. Colors seemed a fraction too vivid, sounds a beat too sharp, textures a touch too coarse. It was as if the human sensory apparatus, designed for a different kind of inhabitant, was beginning to reject its foreign tenant. Eleanor called again, her voice brimming with cheerful concern. "Robert, you sound a little off today," she remarked, a subtle note of unease entering her tone. "Are you getting enough rest?" The doppelganger processed her words, analyzing the shift in her perception. Its practiced responses felt less automatic, a fraction of a second slower. The subtle charm it had cultivated faltered, replaced by a strained precision. It assured her it was fine, just a touch tired, but the conversation ended abruptly, a faint sense of unease lingering in the air. The doppelganger recognized the first crack in its perfect facade, a human intuition piercing through its meticulous mimicry. The philosophical text, once a source of effortless comprehension, now seemed to mock it with its complexity. Words swam on the page, ideas tangled, refusing to coalesce into coherent thought. The doppelganger closed the book, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor passing through its hand. It walked to the mirror, its gaze fixed on its reflection. The face staring back was still Robert Moore's, but the vibrant blue eyes now held a frantic, almost desperate quality. The subtle smile that had once touched its lips was gone, replaced by a taut, unnerving stillness. It saw not a perfect imitation, but a strained, fragile mask, a vessel under immense internal pressure. A new sensation began to emerge, not an emotion, but a profound, almost physical yearning, a yearning for something else, something beyond this meticulous, borrowed existence. A desire to shed the skin, to escape the confines of this human form that was now resisting it, to return to whatever void it had emerged from. The apartment, once a perfectly controlled environment, began to feel like a prison, its walls pressing in, its silence suffocating. The doppelganger felt a peculiar, internal heat building, a pressure behind its eyes, a deep, resonant hum vibrating through its entire being. It raised a hand, its fingers, once so perfectly human, now seemed to shimmer at the edges, a faint, almost imperceptible distortion. It pressed its palm against the mirror, feeling the cold glass against its skin. The reflection wavered, not in the glass, but in the doppelganger's own perception, its features momentarily blurring, elongating, twisting into something inhuman, something vast and formless. The vibrant blue in its eyes flared, an intense, almost blinding light. With a sudden, overwhelming surge, the doppelganger began to pull away from the reflection, not physically, but internally, a desperate, wrenching separation from the form it had stolen. The metallic scent intensified, filling the room, thick and suffocating. The entire apartment seemed to groan, the floorboards trembling, the walls vibrating with an unseen force. The doppelganger's body began to contort, to twist, to unravel, not into a human form, but into something else, something primal and vast, leaving behind only the echoing silence and a faint, lingering scent of metal.